Hey, everybody, we're back for another episode of the Supply Chain Solutions Ship Show series. Today's Thursday, May 31st, 2023, and this is episode number 20 in our series. And it's that time again, everyone. It's all about the FMR, the Freight Market Roundup. So, Jason, it's one of my favorite parts of the show is when I get to say, what's happening?
Not much, Anthony. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Just boy, I'll tell you, the ebb and flow of the business, you know how it is in supply chain right now and the market conditions. It's like it is changing moment by moment, day by day, week by week. It's just, we're on a roller coaster right now with these market conditions and the economy.
Oh God, I agree with that with you. And honestly, it's kind of funny because we were thinking about it the past couple of weeks, and during the pandemic, we just had our hands tied and we were trying to do the best we can with, our clients being the forefront of our decision making. But the solutions that were out there were few and far between. And everyone was looking for a solution at the same time. So the second there was a opportunity to, shift cargo, it wasn't only you doing it, it was a drove of shippers. So it just was one log jam to the next log jam. And, we rely on a limited number of transporters. And so as a result, if their systems aren't up to snuff, which they weren't, we all kind of get hit in that mumbo jumbo. But it's kind of fun now. I mean, that was so stressful for all of us, but now we're at a point where people really want to save some money. They want to re-strategize. They want to kind of leave the post-pandemic or enter the post-pandemic environment with, a good strategy that's going to put them ahead going forward. And so Anthony and I know we're extremely busy right now, but we're having a ball trying to figure out some unique solutions for people. And there's a lot of new stuff available. So super exciting, very long-winded.
No, hey, listen, Jay. I mean, we love to hear your key insights. It's always very refreshing. Did you have anything in particular that you wanted to start off and talk about with today, besides trends that we would watch?
Yeah. So, let's dive right into it. If this is your first freight market roundup, what I want to do is kind of set the frame here because we don't use slides. We don't run through an agenda. We do this all verbally. So our goal here is we're going to run through each of our major shipping lanes. We're going to start with the Trans-Pacific, then we're going to move over to our transatlantic lanes, and then finally we're going to touch on our Suez lanes. That's on the opposite side of the world. Now, between each section, what we're going to do is talk about some current events. And these current events are applicable for what our teams are worried about or our customers or clients have reached out to us about. Like, hey, what's your feelings on this? Is this going to be a potential disruption for me? Is there a strategy involved here? So we try to kind of bring those to the forefront. Other things that Anthony and I get very interested in are, we love trends and we love understanding where things are going because we've been doing this show for a while. So we'll obviously talk about those too. But we do have a lot of ground to cover. So let's dive in. Almost forgot to mention, after we're done with our ocean trade lanes, just focused on the ocean trade, we're going to dive into our air freight. And finally, we're going to wrap it up with the oil and gas market. And we'll talk to you about what we're going to be focusing on next week too. So back into the ocean shipping. Let's start this thing off. The China, Southeast Asia to U.S. West Coast shipping lane. Now, remember, when we're talking about these trade lanes, we are talking about just the ocean portion when we're referring to costs. We're not talking about, obviously, end-to-end, because end-to-end is different for all of you. But that being said, it really shouldn't come as a surprise. So if you've been with us the last couple shows, this lane has really struggled to hold ground when it comes to cost. And this week is no different than it's been in the past. So right now we are charging roughly 1,300 a TU for shipments that are coming out of the Southeast Asia, China region into the U.S. West Coast ports. And, this is down from a high of right around 1,750, but that was back at the third week of April. And if you remember, we talked about this. In the middle of April, there was a pretty ambitious GRI that came out in this lane. Anthony and I were kind of chuckling about it because we were watching this lane go into free fall. And here you've got the carriers trying to push a massive GRI through. And it didn't stick. It really didn't stick. Now, That being said, we have actually seen this lane lower in cost than it is right now. And, so it is still trending downwards, but very slowly at this point, but still very reasonable as far as cost goes. Anthony and I are expecting some cost stabilization as we get into the summer months. Still we're leaving contract season. That kind of ruffled some feathers. It also gave shippers and ocean carriers the opportunity to have some good discussions about what is a fair cost and also what is a agreeable cost that they can sign a contract to. So that has obviously changed some of the temperament around things, but middle of summer we should see some stabilization as long as we don't have a gray swan event, as Anthony would say.
I love that.
I,
There's
I
a
they're
there's a
entering my
bunch of them
lesson
out
plan.
there in the pipeline. So
There really are. I try to kind of keep my blinders on to them because if you think of all of them at the same time, you're like, okay, gosh, we got to source from next door because I'm nervous if you get on a vessel, right? But oh my God. So, okay. A couple key things going on. So we've been talking about this for over a year, but obviously the ILWU. But I want to quick focus on not the ILWU that's been happening in the US, but the Canada-specific ILWU. It's a little bit confusing with the similar name, but it's just the way it is. So they've had a very rocky period so far since their negotiations began. And I'll give you a little bit of idea of that. So their contract expired on March 31st. Their negotiations began just a couple days before, actually just March 28th. We started hearing rumblings that even pre some of the contract components, there was already some pre-discussion turmoil, and that was back around March 15th. But their contract expired March 31st. They don't have any sort of official agreement out there right now. They do have the government involved in the negotiations because it's been so fraught with issues. But as of May 31st, these negotiations, they've actually entered a second cooling off period. It's a 21-day cooling off period, and it's going to end on June 21st. Now, it allows both of the parties in the contract the right to do a lockout or do a strike, but they need to exercise those after the 21-day cooling off period is up. And also, they need a 72-hour notice prior to that occurring, and they need and that needs to be written and issued. So, this is quite the second one, and even in comparison to our very challenging negotiations we had in the US, they did not start off with such a bang in comparison. Now, what their bargaining agreement or their collective agreement covers is 7,400 unionized dock workers and foremen, and they are, obviously employed throughout Canada's West Coast ports. Now, for a little bit of reference, the last contract negotiation that these same West Coast Canadian port workers went through took around 18 months. So definitely it's longer than we're expecting actually for our US one that still isn't wrapped up, unfortunately. But it is one thing that happened in the last negotiations is they just were more peaceful, to put it that way. They didn't get to this really aggressive point so soon, at least. So that's definitely something to note. Anthony, anything you want to mention on that before I move on?
yeah, I just wanted to go back real quick. I think there's not a lot to add in what you talked about, with the negotiations with the ILWU and the ILA. I mean, you're spot on. One of the things I wanted to mention on the market conditions, especially that Asia Pacific rim, is that I think when we talk about market conditions, the expectations of a second half container volume recovery can now be filed under an official let's kick the can down the road situation. And this really, I think Jason and I, as well as some of our executive management within Supply Chain Solutions, we're hearing this supported by many industry leaders that we're close with and that we have our finger on the pulse of, including, Jeremy Nixon, who's the CEO of O&E. And, they recently announced just this past week that the volume recovery is really going to be much slower than expected and really delayed going into July. And I think, there's a real lack of clear market signs, like including raw material movement on the intra-Asian routes. And that's one key indicator that a short-term turnaround coming out of the Asia Pacific Rim into the US and into Europe is now unlikely. And, you know, once we see the raw material intra-Asian start to spike, that is really going to signal the beginning of the volume recovery. And, you know, I think that's going to take at least 45 to 60 days. I mean, as durable good orders remain in question for the second half of the year, the chances of us having this strong peak shipping season, as everyone knows, we should be in peak season right now, really, you know, it's really in doubt. And even though they tried to, you know, increase, you know, implement a GRI on April 15th, that was successfully pushed onto the market by the ocean carriers and that has been erased in the last 30 days, we do expect downward pressure on a short-term market rate through the remainder of the month. And I think there's a lot of situations that are dictating that, that are really unfolding, you know, as we speak. But you know, we have heard, and dare I say, we are hearing rumblings that the ocean carriers are going to be announcing a substantial general rate increase in the second half of June. But this could really be in jeopardy too, because we know that the market is depressed. Okay. And we're hearing that, you know, there could be a potential June 15th GRI of at least 60% into the West Coast and, you know, into the U.S. East Coast and the U.S. IPI destinations over 30%. So I think it's something that we really have to watch. I am very skeptical that they're going to be able to pull this off because of the inflation and just the downturn in consumer spending in the economy. So I just wanted to put that out there for everybody, Jay.
You're spot on. And I think that, you know, one of the big challenges has been how rapidly everything's happening because, you know, companies and people, they can't keep up, right? We watched rates obviously skyrocket when we go back to the pandemic, but they also fell at the same speed. And so everyone, you know, from a business planning standpoint, it's been really, really challenging. And, you know, throughout this, we can go all the way back to the 301 tariffs that were put on, you know, basically blanket across almost all the Chinese goods. And then you've got your US West Coast, which is the main recipient of those Chinese goods. And that rate went through the roof and reliability went down. And now the rate went down, but reliability is still down. And so it's very, very, very challenging out there. I mean, it's really, we got a lot of sympathy for our customers. We're seeing it, we're working with it, and we know those challenges. And I totally agree with you as well. I think Anthony and I are also in a very interesting seat because we've seen the predictions, we've seen the data, and we've seen how misleading it can be month over month. And, you know, yeah, we're sitting here at, you know, the first half of the year, but we're already talking about the beginning of 2024. And that is so true. I mean, that's the lens we really have. There's checkpoints we should have hit, which we haven't hit. And as a result, everything is pushed back. We already know this. There's no magic way of undoing the damage that's been done so far, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Perfect, Jay. Go ahead. Go on, Jay. I know you have more.
Oh yeah. Well, there's a couple things going on here, and unfortunately, I hate to give all the tough pills to swallow, but there is a new thing happening on the U.S. West Coast of the Trans-Pacific lane. And this is not the first time it's happened, but being deployed again, this is kind of a little bit of a boon when it comes to shippers. So this idea of super slow steaming, it's been deployed in the past, but it's another capacity lever that ocean carriers can use, and it's back. So what we saw over the course of April was the average vessel speed went down by 3.4%. So that's a means of kind of just slowing everything down, soaking up capacity. Now, while 3.4% doesn't seem like a lot, that is an average. So some of the vessels and some of the vessel operators did not slow down, but others slowed down as much as 10%. And so if you are used to a very regular schedule reliability, and it's really not schedule reliability, it's transit time, now you're going to be in a different kind of bracket when it comes to that transit time. Getting back to that schedule reliability word, what the ocean liners have suggested is that the slower steaming the super slow steaming that it's kind of called is beneficial for is improving schedule reliability. But I mean, as this data came out, there was a drove of analysts that just basically said, nope, every time you've done this in the past, we've never seen an increase in schedule reliability. So, just make sure you're understanding how long your transit time is going to take if you're shipping into the US West Coast out of the Southeast Asia, China region. And, if you're right on the line when it comes to payment terms, unfortunately, you may have to work with, people on both ends of the spectrum to update those terms to better reflect the time it's going to take.
Mm.
Because this is a problem that is going to be here for at least 3 months. And, as hopefully as we can get a little bit of demand back just to cushion the system, not to bring things back to pre-pandemic, but just as a cushion, that can be alleviated. But again, that's just a 3-month right here, new thing you're going to have to be dealing with. So keep that in mind.
And Jay, real quick, just to a little caveat, that's an excellent point and very insightful. So there's slow steaming and there's super slow steaming. And let's just clarify for our listeners, slow steaming is really a practice of operating transoceanic cargo ships and container ships where they steam, okay, they're still using an antiquated term called steaming, right? There's no more steam engines, right? We had a significantly less speed. So, super slow steaming means that these ocean carriers can reduce fuel consumption by at least 59% by reducing their cargo ship speed from 27 knots, okay, to 33 knots, 18 knots, which is about 21 miles an hour. And that's all at the cost of an additional week sailing. So I just thought we would clarify, so our listeners know what that difference between, slow steaming and super slow steaming is. But that's an excellent point, Jason.
I just got to make a comment because I just can't get it out of my head. So as a sailor, knots make sense to me, but just hearing miles per hour, brings me to the driving world. Imagine driving at a residential speed from China to the US.
Yeah. Right.
Oh God.
Oh my God.
That's a journey.
Yeah.
Anyway. All right. So let's move it on. Transatlantic. Remember, we're going to talk about what we're seeing with the ocean rates. This is, and now also, these are the rates compiled as of last week. And so we take a look at all the shipments we've done, we get our averages, and then we share them with you. So, the transatlantic, so now the Europe to the US East Coast shipments, they have been a star of the show pretty much so far this year, up until it's past 3 to 5 weeks. So right now, we're seeing rates from Europe to the U.S. East Coast averaging right around $2,100 a TEU. And this has actually kind of found a semi-solid floor for the past 3 weeks. And I'm pretty surprised because, we've got all this new capacity entering the system. Also, the East Coast is now under contract negotiations. So I honestly am surprised it's as high as 2,100 a TEU at the moment. But I want a quick dive into the history here. So if we understand we're right now at 2,100, we've been at around 2,100 for roughly 3 weeks. We go back to the beginning of March, we were at 4,500 a TEU for this lane. Now, it hasn't gone above that point since the beginning of March. It's actually, quite frankly, just been on a steady decline. And, if we fast forward from March to April, we had a rate of around 3,450. And then if we go to the first week of May, 2,700. Now we're at 2,100. So it's been pretty incremental and it's dropping. It's been consistently dropping. Now it's got this interesting semi-solid floor. And, to give some context, 2,100 is about $1,000 more a TEU than it was pre-pandemic. So prior in 2019, you could get a container for around 1,000, maybe under 1,100 between Europe and the US. And so we've got a decent buffer there. You haven't seen this buffer really in other lanes. It's only been 1% or 2% above, sometimes as high as 10%, but that's about it. This lane is a little bit stubborn, but it is finding a floor. Anthony, anything you want to add to that?
Just, you're spot on. I mean, I think that what we're seeing right now is, Charleston, Savannah, Norfolk, New York. There's minor congestion. Things are pretty open. There hasn't really been a lot of increases, even though carriers are trying to increase rates right now, because the mantra that the carriers are coming out with is that they're losing money on every one of their trade lanes right now,
Mhm.
because there's such a lack of volume. So, um, you know, we're sort of stable, but it's just something we have to keep our finger on the pulse of and watch.
Yeah, I I agree. Yeah, it's a little tough, right? Because they also bought all these vessels, and now it's like, okay, with demand drying up and inventory stuck in the system, they're in a tough spot. They're in a spot where they'd be.
Yeah, and when you think about it, like when you just think of like Europe to the East Coast, like in Italy, space is available. There's plenty of space. The ocean freight rates are stable. Air freight capacity is increasing slightly with the summer season approaching, and so a lot more flights have been scheduled into the East Coast. For example, in France, there have been some port strikes in the port of Le Havre and Fos-sur-Mer. And some of those strikes have eased up and the operations are starting to run as usual. But at the same time, there's still a little bit of, ebb and flow of the rates as the carriers try to implement these GRIs. So it's a really fluid situation. Every day it's something new.
Mhm.
Um, it's not like in the old days, and I've been in this industry a long time, where you put your pricing in place when you signed a contract in May, and maybe you had one GRI or a peak season,
Yeah,
and you were able to hold rates for a long time, months and months. But it's a totally different ball game now, folks.
totally different. Oh my gosh, that actually is so. That's a really solid line. That's really impactful because you and me both know how TRIs have been, even just prior to the pandemic. Not
Yeah.
not even pandemic, but just such a regular occurrence that it's yeah, you're just not phased by it. You weren't at least phased by it. Now it's raising rates when we aren't shipping. What's going on here? you know. So, okay. One thing I want to talk about. I want to talk about Europe and their intra-Europe shipments. And this will be a topic of one of our shows at some point because there's a lot of information coming out of it. It's been a lot of initiatives that have been happening within Europe, and it is going to affect you in the future. And this actually, all of the initiatives may be changed. So, the European Green Deal environmental policy, it aimed to double freight's share of inland transport. They wanted to bring it up to 30%. And they also wanted to increase waterway transport all the way up to 50% by 2050. So the idea here is only the very first miles and the very last miles are handled on the road. Now, the problem is that this shift was announced prior to the pandemic and then it was updated during the pandemic. But progress has been non existent. Actually, the opposite has been occurring. So in March, it was revealed that, excuse me, um, in March of 2010, it was revealed that rail and inland waterways represented around 25% of the total inland cargo handled in Europe. And when we got up to 2020, that 25% dropped to 23%, with 77% of the cargo being handled by the road. So, that was actually after this deal was inked, and there was still a drop that occurred. So, given the constraints that have happened during the pandemic, and now we've got over the past year, obviously, the diesel price issues, and Europe has obviously felt that in a very different way because of how they source a lot of their energy. Um, but also with a lot of the other issues that have been happening, we just saw a contraction of 13.9% when you're talking about combined transport. So that's rail and also this waterway. It was a 13.9% contraction just in Q1 of this year. So it's not looking good for this initiative, but there has been a considerable amount of interest in making this happen. So I am really interested to see what the future of this initiative is, if they're going to double down on it or if they're going to take a break from it. Anthony, any opinions on that?
N- Not really, Jay. I mean, I think you've said everything that you could say about that. I mean, that's just again something we're really going to have to watch
Mhm.
and see how that goes.
Yeah, shipping intra Europe, there what's great about it is you can find some really awesome options. But when things are forced onto the roadway, that's not good for us either because the road laws in Europe are different than the road laws here. And
Yeah,
also just the way it operates. If you can get on a barge, generally speaking, you are in a good situation. You can get a great rate for an intra Europe transit. But as we talked about over the past couple of years, the hardest thing about during the pandemic with schedule reliability tanks is that there's so many more links on their intra shipping that it really messes things up. You've got feeder vessels, something we don't utilize as much as Europe does, and when those schedules are off, you can't load the boats because the containers haven't arrived or you missed the boat, and it can really be a massive domino effect. A lot harder to get around than here in the States.
absolutely, absolutely.
Let's move on. China to Europe. So, like our transatlantic lanes, China to Europe, it's actually been sitting at this semi-solid floor price as well. Now, I kind of hesitated when I say semi-solid because this is substantially more solid than the Europe to US East Coast lane. It's been sitting there actually since the beginning of March. So we haven't seen since the beginning of March the China to Europe lane going through the Suez cost per TEU go above 1425 and it's averaged right around 1400. So you can get an idea of how kind of honed in that lane has been since the beginning of March. Been the most stable lane that we've had. Now do we expect this lane to go up in cost or down? I'm really at this point not sure. And I think it's going to come down to the geopolitics that happen over the next 3 to 6 months, how China's alignment with Russia continues, if there's any issues with Taiwan. But really, you see this still, and I talked about this the last freight market roundup. There's still this really weird inverted rate where shipments that aren't making it all the way to Europe are more expensive than the shipments that are going to Europe, suggesting that there's less capacity going to Europe in general and more capacity that's just doing a shorter route, which is costing more. So, in comparison, this kind of flipped area where it's going not quite to Europe is costing around $2,400 right now. It is slightly down from 5 weeks ago at 2,600, but as you can see, that's a much slower decline in price. And actually, it's been sitting at around 2,400 for the past 3 weeks. So it's
Right.
a bit of a floor.
And let me just add something to that, Jay, because that's a very insightful comment. And one thing I want to say about this, not only just going from Asia to Europe, but just going from Asia to the US, we're in a situation now where as the rate market continues to collapse, and we're seeing weaker ocean freight rates, whether it's China to Europe or China to the US, the China sourcing shift where people are starting to decouple and move away from China, are shifting a drive, a sort of or a rise in more LCL shipments and more frequent LCL shipments, whether it's from China to Europe or China to the USA. And again, with those ocean rates plunging and the space being plentiful, shippers are really reviewing their product needs and their ability to ship less at a very competitive rate. And sometimes and lately, that seems the better way to go rather than just moving a full container load for inventories that are already overloaded, whether it's in Europe or in the USA. So we are starting to see that decoupling from China start to gain momentum. And I think the current growth and demand for LCL seems to be coming from that shift. Into Southeast Asian countries, into India, places like that. So it's just something I wanted to add and attach to what Jason just mentioned.
You know
Excuse
what?
me.
I want to add to what Anthony just said. So we've got a really robust consolidation program we do out of Europe, and we've got an air version, and we also have an ocean version. We reserve this space. We own the containers. We have one partner that we're heavily integrated with. They load, we unload, fewest parties possible touching it. We're building a program like that out of China. We're not sure when it's going to be ready to go. We want to make sure we're working with the right partner and we're integrated deeply. But at some point, we're going to have that option as well. We've done it in the past just with our customer base, and that's been great. But now with this rise in LCL, there's a new need for it. And so we want to be in a situation where we're not relying on other companies, where it can be our own, our designed, and ours under control, so it can be best service possible. So yeah, keep an eye out for that, especially if you're shipping from China to the US with us right now. So a couple things going on. Talked about how this rate has found its kind of floor, and it's been at that floor for a long time, and the inverted rate's more, suggesting that decline in the China to Europe shipments. Now, there's a company that's actually bet against this. It's a Singapore-based company, PSA International and Kazakhstan Railways. You can guess, based on the railways, that it is a land connection between China and Europe. So if you kind of go back in history and you talk about the land connection, 95% of all China-Europe rail freight used to pass through this northern corridor area, and that goes through Russia. Obviously, that has not been as popular since the Ukraine war. And now it's being avoided by most importers and exporters. So it's shifted a lot of that rail to ocean that was destined to go to Europe. Now, what's happened here is this Singapore-based PSA International and Kazakhstan Railways, they've started a joint venture, and the goal is to kind of build a middle corridor. And they sort of have. And so the idea is it's a way to sidestep Russia, but get the Chinese to Europe shipments. Now, that being said, there's a lot of interesting data out there that suggests this might not be the greatest move. So data actually says, oh, hey, you know, the China to Europe has increased by 6% rail over 2022. Now, what's interesting is this is the China Railway Express that presented this data, but it's a state-owned company, and also it doesn't actually say the destination. It says the two endpoints, and it says the amount of rail transferring has gone up. Now, SIVA stepped in and said, okay, that's a little bit misleading. SIVA estimates there's been a lot of growth, but it's actually been a shift as well, and a much bigger shift than we'd expect. So they're expecting the China to Central Asia freight, China to Central Asia freight, has increased by 30% just last year. And the cargo from China to Russia has increased by 60%. So that's a miraculous shift. And also, so I'm not really sure with this middle corridor how much popularity that's going to have, at least at this moment, but there's definitely freight moving. It's just where it's going to is very different. So keep that in mind. Anthony, I got a few more things, but we're already over time. So anything you want to add? And I might just dive straight into our air freight so people can
why don't you just dive right in? That'd be great.
Yeah, let's do that.
Thank
real
you,
quick.
Jen.
Yeah, no problem at all. Okay, guys, apologize for going over time. So let's quick talk about our air freight. If you're shipping out of China or Southeast Asia, you're coming to the US, right now we're actually seeing a little bit higher rates than we have been. Let's go back 5 weeks to give a little bit of a trend. We started at $5.20 a kilo 5 weeks ago. Then we go back 3 weeks. We had a short-term low at around $4.49 a kilo. And now we're back up to around $4.80 a kilo. If you've been following Apple, there's a lot of rumors saying they're coming out with their VR headset. That's going to be next week. Now, granted, Apple's actually shifted a lot of their manufacturing away from China, but it still can affect air freight in the region. So keep that in mind, and that could be a big reason for some of this capacity getting sucked up. Now, if we're moving onward to the Europe to US air shipments, remember, we've got a fantastic consolidation program. If you're not shipping a lot of air, or even if you are shipping a lot of air, you should reach out to us because we are reserving space weekly. And as a result, we've just got that space locked down. We've got excellent rates and fantastic service. And our schedule reliability is right now phenomenal too. So make sure you reach out to us about that. But let's say you just want to understand, hey, am I paying too much, or what am I paying? Right now, our rates in general, this is not the consolidation rates, this is just our one-off rates, is around $3.04 a kilo, and that was as of last week. So keep that in mind. It's been a little bit higher. Actually, we saw 3 weeks ago, we were at around $2.80. But that was also some phenomenal rates we were able to get. Remember, this is Europe coming into the US. Finally, we've got our oil and gas. A quick one to talk about that. So right now, our average for diesel across the U.S. is $3.85. We talked about backwardation last freight market roundup, and unfortunately, it means that low diesel prices aren't something necessarily to celebrate. But at the same time, we're also in a kind of a pendulum adjusting period. So I would say appreciate the cheaper diesel prices, negotiate with your carriers if you can to get those fuel surcharges in line with what they should be. And save money where you can right now. Next week, we're talking about climate and how those initiatives will affect your bottom line when it comes to ocean shipping. There's a lot of things happening right now, and they're really starting to solidify. So be prepared for more expensive shipments because of carbon taxes and fees on vessels. We'll dive into some depth on that next week. Anthony, anything to add before we close it up?
I think you covered it all. We just want to thank all of our listeners. We're so honored that you guys tune in every week. We hope our information and our perspectives are insightful and poignant for you. And I just want everybody to have a great can't even speak, a great rest of your week, and make it a great day.
Thank you all. Hope you guys had a great last weekend and had a great week so far. Bye, everybody.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye now.
Can't speak either.